Picture the perfect New York slice. That signature chew, the sturdy structure that holds a perfect fold, and that earth-shattering crunch that literally makes people stop mid-conversation when you bite into it. Most people think it's impossible to recreate that magic at home, but they're wrong. Because after obsessing over every possible method to reheat a slice, I've cracked the code. And what I found will completely change how you think about leftover pizza. It'll not only reheat your slice, but actually make it better than when it was fresh. But in order to figure this method out, I needed to do some testing. So I'm gonna test out 7 different methods here, using a plain cheese pie from my pizzeria, which I've allowed to cool completely. And by the way, if you wanna learn how to make pizza like this, I send out exclusive pizza making tips every single week to my email newsletter, The Pizza Club, so click the link below to join. But anyways, I've separated these reheat methods into 2 separate categories. The first category I'm calling the oven methods, because, well, they involve using an oven. And you would think that this will lead to the best results since it's most similar to what actual pizzerias do. However, if my pizza journey has taught me anything, it's that a home oven is very different than a pizza oven. So replicating exactly what pizzerias do is not always the best option. Plus, I think you might agree, it seems kind of wasteful to fire up your whole oven just to reheat one tiny slice, especially during the summer when you probably don't want to heat your entire house up. Which is why I also came up with 3 more methods I'm going to test, which I'm calling the non-oven methods, for obvious reasons. And that's actually where we're going to start here. So let's heat some slices. All right, so I've got 3 different test subjects here. The first is a little bit of a goofy one, but I figured it was worth trying, and that is the microwave. I just nuked it for about 30 seconds, just until the cheese started to kind of melt, and it was good to go. The second one, I cooked it on the stovetop, and I covered the slice with a lid because otherwise you'd only be getting heat from the bottom. So I was hoping that by adding that lid, it would help to melt the cheese on top. The third method is one of the most frequently recommended ones I see online, which is the air fryer. It only took about a minute at 450 degrees for the slice to get nice and crispy to my liking. Now, in order to eliminate bias here, I'm gonna try to do this as a blind taste test. Obviously, with these different methods, it may not be hard to tell which is which, but it certainly doesn't hurt to try. Let's give these babies a try. Wow, super crispy. The crust there has sort of a lightness to it where, you bite into it and you get that satisfying crisp, but then you get the moisture from sort of the cheese and the tomatoes on top, and I think it adds a really nice contrast. Let's try option number 2 here. So that one definitely very solid as well, but something I didn't expect actually is that it even has a different flavor than the first one. I'm getting a little more of like a darker sort of smoky flavor, especially on the bottom of the crust. And these all came from the same pie, so really the only difference could be caused by that reheat method. I also feel like maybe the cheese isn't quite as kind of melty and bubbly as the previous one. It feels almost more like a solid layer of cheese as opposed to the first one, which really maintained, I think, the integrity of the original slice. But with that, let's try number 3. Wow. That sucks. That is soft, but not crunchy. Shout out to Vito, whatever his name is. Never met the guy, but seems like a nice enough guy. If that's not the microwave pizza, I gotta rethink my life here. So anyways, this one is definitely the loser. And there's also a pretty clear winner here to me. And it is this first one right here. So this option gave me everything I was looking for. It brought the sauce back to life with the sweetness and tanginess of it, melted the cheese, gave me that crisp, light, airy texture that I'm looking for. So what was it? It was the air fryer, which means that this one is the stovetop. And honestly, I'm not too surprised about that result. Obviously the stovetop, you're really only getting heat from the bottom, and even with the lid, that can only do so much to melt the cheese on top. The microwave, I mean, the way this works, it pretty much just vibrates the molecules within the pizza, so it's sort of heating it from the outside in. And it's basically impossible to achieve any sort of crispness. Whereas an air fryer is kind of like a mini pizza oven. This one in particular, the Typher Dome 2, has 360-degree heating technology, meaning it's got dual heating elements on both the top and bottom. And in fact, I like it so much that I agreed to have Typher sponsor this video. Because while this air fryer is great for reheating pizza, it can do so much more than that. It's become my favorite way to cook wings for that beautifully crispy skin, and also to my surprise, it cooks an amazing steak with very little effort. I'll just set it to the steak setting, and after a quick preheat, all I have to do is pop the the steak in there, flip it halfway through, and boom, perfectly seared on the outside and juicy on the inside. But the Dome 2 can do more than just steak, wings, and pizza. It has 15 different cooking functions, including pizza, steak, wings, fries, bacon, frozen, air fry, toast, grill, bake, griddle, roast, broil, dehydrate, and reheat, covering nearly every cooking need. It's also got a self-cleaning function to get rid of grease and grime so it doesn't create smoke and odors in your kitchen. This air fryer has easily become my favorite low-effort way to cook, and right now you can get an extra 10% off the Typher Dome 2 using my discount code Charlie11, or purchase on Amazon using the link below and the code will automatically be applied. So thanks again to Typher for sponsoring this video, and thank you for your support. Now let's fire up the big oven and see what this thing can do. And I've come up with 4 different methods here. The first is a classic pizza stone. The second is a baking steel, which is the one I usually prefer for home pizza since it transfers heat more quickly than stone. The third is a baking sheet, as a nice sort of budget alternative for those that don't have a stone or a steel. And the fourth is a pizza screen, because I was very curious to see what effect leaving the bottom of the slice open to air would have on it. Now for all these methods, I preheated my oven to 550 degrees with the baking vessel inside, except for the screen since preheating it wouldn't really do much, but I did still bake at 550 degrees there. Now with the stone and baking sheet, I baked for 2 minutes until the pizza was nice and crisp and the cheese was melty. With the steel and screen though, I was able to take the pizza out within just a minute and a half due to the higher conductivity of the steel and the more direct heat that the screen allowed. Now let's see what we're working with. Alrighty, so of course we're gonna do this as a blind taste test again. I feel like this one should be maybe a little less obvious than the last one, considering they were all baked in the oven. But I am very curious to see what difference those subtle changes can make. We all know I really like the steel for baking pizzas from scratch, but the question is, does it work the same way when we're reheating pizza? So let's give these all a try. That one has a pretty unique crunch to it, I would say. It's almost like a drier bottom than what I'm used to. If I had to guess, that one's probably the screen. I will say the top cheese could be a little more melted, but that's the challenge with all of these. You know, it's a balance between not overcooking the bottom while also making sure that the top is cooked enough. Obviously, you don't want to dry out the dough itself too, so you don't want to bake it for longer than like 2 or 2.5 minutes at the most. Definitely different from the first. The bottom has almost like that sort of smoky flavor I was talking about from the first round. It's got a really nice crispness to it. The cheese melted nicely too, but I will say the dough's a little bit dry compared to what I would probably like. Let's try this next one here. Seemed like possibly a little stiffer crust on that one, but when you bite into it, I mean, it's almost indistinguishable from this last slice. These two are pretty much the same, and I would say they are slightly better than this one here. Again, mostly just due to the fact that the cheese melted a little more nicely on top, so you got sort of a more even cook throughout the whole slice. Try this last one though. Seems like maybe not quite as stiff as the others, which honestly I think is a good thing. So that one here is definitely my favorite of the bunch. It kind of has, as you can see, a less dry, stiff structure to it. You know, so it reminds me a lot more of sort of the original form of the slice. Quite a bit more charring on the bottom of this one though, which, you know, could be a good or a bad thing depending on your preferences. But for me, again, I want it to be as similar to the original slice as possible. So ideally, I don't want to add too much extra color on the bottom. Other than that though, the dough is definitely the least dry of all of them. And while it's still a pretty solid choice, it's not quite 100% of the way there. And I think I have an idea for that, but before we get into that, let's see what we're working with here. This first one, the screen, just as I suspected. Second one here, the baking sheet. Here we got the stone, which means that the last one, as I sort of expected, is the steel. You know, again, with that steel, you're able to bake it in a little shorter amount of time because of that higher conductivity. And so you're able to avoid drying out the slice a little bit more while still heating it up enough. Again, though, I'm getting a little bit of that extra bitterness and charring because that stone is so hot. Again, these are all acceptable methods though, and I definitely think you'd be happy with any of these leftover pizzas. However, we're not just trying to be happy. We're trying to come up with the ultimate method for reheating your pizza. Something that's gonna restore it back to its former glory, or at least as close as we can possibly get. Let me explain. So I think I finally figured out the problem here. You see, when you cook a fresh pizza, basically the moisture from the inside leaves as steam, and so that's what helps the crust to get nice and crispy. However, as that slice cools, steam continues to work its way to the outside, making the exterior moist and soggy. When you reheat it though, that moisture on the surface evaporates, making the crust extra crispy. But here's the thing, the longer you heat it, the more moisture escapes from the inside and the more the slice dries out. So the real trick here is is heating the slice as quickly as possible, ideally less than a minute. But the problem is, without a blazing hot pizza oven, how are we gonna get the slice heated that thoroughly in such a short period of time? Well, that's where my two ideas come in. All right, so I think we got some very interesting results here. And of course, for the full effect, I had to do full-size slices for this test. So, we can see the foldability of it, the crispiness of the top and bottom crust. Overall, it should just give us a true representation of how good each of these methods is. So again, blind taste test, and I'll reveal each of the methods as I decide who the winner is. Slice number one, got a good foldability to it, a little curling on the edge there, which you've seen with a couple of these methods. A little soft on the top. Definitely not bad. Already, I think, better than any of the other methods we've tried so far. It does have like a little weird chewiness to it, just ever so slightly. So I almost think maybe there's too much moisture in it now. But anyways, let's try the next one before we make any conclusions here. Definitely not bad. There were some parts where it was a little soft on the bottom, almost like I got a little extra moisture on the bottom there. So I think I have an idea which one this is, but again, let's try this last one. Easily, I think the most ideal structure here. You can definitely feel the crispness and crunchiness on the top, whereas these last couple, were pretty soft on the top. Let's see what we're working with. This is a really tough one because honestly, these are all pretty solid. So let's take a look at which one's which, and I'll explain the thought process behind them. First one, interesting. So with this one, I actually microwaved the slice for about 30 seconds just to kind of get it heated all the way through, get that top cheese melting a little bit. But as we saw last time, the microwave slice was far too soft. So what I did then was throw it on a hot pan just for about a minute, and I covered it up too to maintain the heat in there. And with that, I was able to crisp up the bottom pretty nicely while still having that nice cheese melt. Again, it had maybe a little weird chewiness from that sort of microwaved effect, but I think just microwaving it for a little bit less time might fix that. Now this next one was sort of a similar idea. With this one, I threw it in the pan right away, but along with it, I also put an ice cube in there and then threw the lid on top. The thinking behind that is that the ice cube will sort of slowly melt and evaporate, and that extra moisture locked into the pan will kind of help this crust to stay soft and prevent it from drying out. And it definitely did work, although as I pointed out, the top crust was quite a bit softer than I would ideally want it to be. The majority of the slice is great, but when you do get to that end crust, it's definitely gonna leave something to be desired. So this last method I came up with here was actually baked in the air fryer again. This one was at 425 degrees though, because I noticed last time at 450, it might have just gotten a little bit too crispy and slightly dried out. So this one was a fair bit better, although there were still spots on the bottom where it wasn't quite as crispy as I would have wanted it. So like I mentioned though, none of these were quite 100% there for me still. What I really want is a method that's gonna give me that crispness on the bottom, that nicely melted cheese on the top, but without drying out the crust. And in fact, all this testing has given me two more ideas that I think might get me to exactly what I'm looking for. At least, let's hope so. All right, I feel pretty good about these ones here. Let's take a look at them. Got a nice structure. Seems fairly crisp on the bottom, crisp on the top, but not too dry. Not bad. Other slice, same thing. Maybe even more crisp on the bottom. Got a little give on the top, indicating that there's still a good amount of moisture in there, but you can hear that crispness as well. Let's give them a try. That's what I've been looking for. So the problems I had before were with the oven, it tended to dry the slices out because you couldn't quite bake them quick enough to get them fully heated before that moisture evaporated. With the pan, it worked fairly well, especially with the ice cube. But number one, it's hard to find a pan that's big enough for a slice of pizza. So you're always gonna get maybe a little water touching the slice, which makes it soggy. But even more importantly, it's pretty much impossible to get that crispness back on the top of the crust because you just don't have any heat from the top. The microwave, well, for obvious reasons, isn't ideal. I mean, it just doesn't crisp up the slice at all. And the air fryer had the same problems as the oven. In my opinion, it got it almost a little too crispy. And then when I tried to bake at a lower temperature or for a shorter amount of time, it didn't seem to get quite hot enough. However, it had some promise though, because having both the top and bottom heat, it is kind of a game changer. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, it's basically like a mini pizza oven. So that got me thinking, how can we get both that intense top and bottom heat so that the slice can bake in a short amount of time, but still get that that crispness on the bottom? And the answer was actually probably the most obvious one that I could have thought of. So what I did was heated my baking steel again at my oven's highest temperature, which in this case is 550. I put it on my oven's second highest rack because that's just where I found it gets to the ideal temperature for baking pizza for me, but that might vary depending on your oven. The key though is that before I put the slice in, I turn on the broiler in my oven. That way, with the steel providing the heat from the bottom and the broiler providing that intense heat from the top, I could get the slice to cook in just about 60 seconds, which was the perfect amount of time to re-crisp it up, heat it all the way through without drying it out. And so that was this slice right here. It's definitely very, very solid, but with my second method, I added one extra step, which I think just takes it to a whole nother level. And it seems a little unusual, so bear with me here. This one was again cooked for a total of 1 minute, but for the first 20 seconds of cooking, I cooked it in the microwave. From there, I threw it into my oven with the preheated baking steel and the broiler on for that last 40 seconds. I do think it made a pretty big difference. It seemed to maintain a little bit more moisture in the crust and get the cheese and sauce heated a little bit more thoroughly. I will say next time I do it, I'd probably only microwave for about 10 to 15 seconds and then use the oven for the remaining 45 or 50, but you can sort of play around with it, and it's definitely going to be dependent on your individual oven anyways. Now, unfortunately, it does require you heating your whole oven, but the same method can be used in the air fryer. Just microwave it for another 10 or 15 seconds, and then air fry for the remaining 45, and it'll solve those sort of issues that I had mentioned earlier. I also tried this with other styles of pizza, like this grandma I made earlier, and it works perfectly. Honestly, the microwave seems to have even more of a benefit for those thicker styles of pizza because you need it to be heated from the inside out. Of course, though, you still want the bottom and top to be crispy, so that's where the oven or air fryer comes in. Again though, if you don't want to add that extra step, you can get great results in your oven using just the steel in the broiler, or even a stone or baking tray in a broiler if you don't have a steel. The key though is to not cook it for too long. I would say no longer than a minute, because remember, this is meant to be used for pizza that's already fully cooked. However, when you're making an entire pizza from scratch, sometimes you may want to use reheating as an actual part of the recipe, and that's exactly what I did in my New York style pizza recipe in order to create that authentic slice shop result at home. So if you haven't seen that, you can check that video out right here. Either way, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.